Thank you so much for joining us. And so we'll begin shortly. My name is Lauren Gorlick. I serve as the Community Relations Coordinator for Child and Family Services Haven House. And today I am accompanied by two of my colleagues at Haven House, Tara Petty and Sarah Joslin, who are joining us for this second webinar. Before we begin, I just have a couple of announcements and things to share. I do want to thank all of the sponsors who joined us for Domestic Violence Awareness Month this year to support Haven House. And we are especially grateful to each of you, and as well as to our lead sponsor, Alexandria Professional. Thank you so much for supporting our program and this webinar speaker series. I do want to share that we have a number of resources available to survivors of domestic violence, and they will be linked in the chat feature today. This includes our 24-hour emergency hotline. That number is 884-6000, as well as a link to our chat feature, our online chat feature, which connects a survivor with one of our team members virtually as well. So that'll be included in the chat function, as well as a link taking you to all of the events that we have for Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So I'll begin by sharing Tara and Sarah's biographies, and then we'll jump right into the presentation. So Tara Petty is the Erie County High Risk Team Coordinator here at Haven House. Tara graduated from the University at Buffalo with a master's in social work after completing her bachelor's in social work at Buffalo State College. Tara started working at Haven House in 2018 as the Child and Family Advocate, facilitating the Domestic Violence Education and Parenting After Violence program for parents experiencing domestic violence. Tara also works part-time at the Western New York Perinatal Bereavement Network as the Family Support Coordinator, providing support to families experiencing a prenatal loss. Sarah Joslin graduated from Niagara University in 2017 with a liberal arts degree concentrating in social work, sociology, and women's studies. She has been a Haven House Justice Court Advocate out of Haven House for 3 years and working out of 11 jurisdictions in Erie County. She has recently accepted a new position as one of the IDV and felony court advocates. Prior to working at Haven House, she interned as a rape crisis advocate in the Lockport area. So with this in mind, I know our audience is ready for the presentation, as am I, and I'm very excited to hand it over to the both of you. Thanks for joining us today, Sarah and Tara.
All right, thank you, Lauren. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen and get the presentation going. Oh, and it looks like, Lauren, can you give me access to share my screen? Looks like it's been disabled.
I sure can. I apologize for that, everyone. We'll get that going. There we are. You should have that access right now.
All right. So thank you, Lauren, for introducing us and for having us here today. We are going to be talking about trauma and the high risk factors with domestic violence. So today we're going to be taking a look at trauma, sort of understanding it a little bit better, increasing our understanding of domestic violence as a trauma. We'll talk about some high risk factors for domestic violence, homicide, as well as the challenges that survivors face as they navigate systems. And then we'll talk about some services that are available to survivors, both court advocacy as well as the high risk team. So before we get started, I like to just make a note about a few points about the language that we'll be using today. So most of the time when I talk about those experiencing domestic violence, I tend to use female pronouns. And for those perpetrating the violence, we tend to use male pronouns. This is sort of just for clarity's sake. We do recognize that all genders do experience domestic violence, that men can be victims as well. However, we also are aware that about 85 to 95% of domestic violence victims do identify as female. So just for sake of clarity, I do tend to use gendered pronouns. I just like to sort of put a disclaimer out there. And then also, I sort of use the term survivor and victim interchangeably. Survivor is definitely a more empowered label that many of our clients identify with and feel more comfortable using. I also recognize that there is, someone who's experienced domestic violence has also been a victim. So I don't use that term in any sort of disparaging way, but just as an acknowledgement of what they've endured. So just a note that I do tend to use those two interchangeably. And then when we're talking about court proceedings, typically the survivor is identified as the complainant. And then similarly with the abuser, we tend to use abuser or offender or perpetrator as well. I just like to make a note about the language. So then I want to jump in and just sort of briefly overview services that are available at Haven House. For those of you who don't know, Haven House is the domestic violence services component of child and family services. So we provide both residential and non-residential services. We have our shelter on site. We also provide children's programming through shelter, as well as our transitional housing. Our non-residential services, we provide supportive counseling, both DV specific as well as parenting for parents who have experienced domestic violence. We also offer a variety of groups, including support groups. We have a wonderful art empowerment program, as well as our domestic violence education and parenting after violence program. We're able to offer the economic empowerment program, which is a wonderful program that helps survivors financially get back on their feet and work towards financial independence. We know that in almost all domestic violence relationships, there's a component of financial abuse. So this program is really critical in helping survivors have access to resources that are going to be helpful for them in maintaining obtaining and maintaining financial independence. We also have our new rapid rehousing program, which helps survivors secure housing for them. And then we'll talk more in depth today about our court and legal advocacy services as well. And then on the screen, you see our 24-hour hotline. We also now have a 24-hour chat, which is available for survivors to reach out if they need support. This was something we were able to launch at the beginning of the pandemic as another safe option for someone experiencing domestic violence who might need support. So those are a few of the sort of an overview of the services that Haven House provides. And I think one thing that's really good to know is that all of our services are free to clients. There's no charge to them. And that's, we're able to do that. So yes. Okay.
So just to give a little bit of a definition of domestic violence, domestic violence is defined as a pattern of coercive behavior where one individual uses fear and intimidation to gain and maintain power and control over another closely related individual. Intimate partner violence, or as we call it IPV, is DV between partners in intimate and romantic relationships, so dating relationships, marriages. DV can happen to anyone regardless of age, race, culture, socioeconomic status, gender, etc. And then next to that, we have the power and control wheel, which shows the various ways that an abuser uses control over his or her victim. And just some facts and statistics for you guys. About 85 to 95% of victims of domestic violence are women. Domestic violence will affect 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men at some point in their life. Domestic violence accounts for 21% of all violent crime. 1 in 2 female murder victims and 1 in 13 male murder victims are killed by their intimate partners. 65% of female victims killed by a former intimate partner had ended their relationship within 3 months of the homicide, which I think is really important to note because the most dangerous time for someone in an abusive relationship is when they are attempting to leave it. 84% of female victims and 61% of male victims disclosed their abuse to somebody. And it takes victims an average of 7 attempts to leave their abuser before they successfully do so.
So I think one thing that is helpful when we're working with clients and we're trying to help support people who are experiencing domestic violence is to understand, what they've gone through and how that might impact them. And so understanding trauma and understanding what it is, what they've gone through, this is something that's really important. So I think, generally as a society, we are discussing trauma more and more. Certainly within the field of social work, we talk a lot about trauma-informed care and really working to make sure that the approach that we take is trauma-informed and that we're supporting clients in a way that is beneficial to them and considers, what have they experienced? What has happened to them? So just sort of a brief just taking a look at what trauma is and how we understand it. At a very basic level, trauma, is the Greek word for wound, right? So just a very basic definition, whether that be a physical wound or an emotional or psychological wound, essentially that's what we're talking about when we talk about trauma, is some sort of wound. Also, when we're talking about traumatic events, it's really important to remember that it's about what that person finds overwhelming. So trauma is very much based on the perception of the person experiencing it as well. The adverse childhood experiences, also known as ACEs, these are stressful or traumatic events that occur during childhood. And the ACE study is one that was sort of laid the groundwork for and the foundation for our understanding of trauma and its effects on children as they go into adulthood and the long-term health effects of experiencing trauma as a child. So then there's also toxic stress, which is it's that stress response that occurs when a person is experiencing strong, frequent, and or prolonged adversity without adequate support. And then lastly up there, that definition from SAMHSA, and SAMHSA is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And so their definition is individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So as we see, from that definition, experiencing trauma impacts the whole person, not just their physical well-being, but also their emotional and social and mental well-being as well. Additionally, when we're talking about trauma, there's a few different kinds of trauma. You can sort of break it down into different categories. There's an acute trauma. It's also sort of called simple trauma. And with that, it's essentially a one-time event. And it's an extreme enough event that it threatens a person's sense of safety, and it can create a lasting impression in their mind. So some examples of a simple or acute trauma would be a natural disaster, a one-time sexual assault, some kind of serious accident. So again, those are going to be events that really overwhelm the person's sense of being able to cope with what's going on. With a chronic trauma, this is going to be multiple long-term and or prolonged exposure over an extended period. So this could be several events of the same acute trauma. Some examples would be a long-term serious illness, sexual abuse that's ongoing, domestic violence, as well as war. And then complex trauma is going to be exposure to varied and multiple traumatic events or experiences, and they usually exist within the context of interpersonal relationships. Some of these examples can include childhood abuse and neglect, sort of those ACEs that we were talking about a couple of minutes ago, as well as domestic violence or civil unrest. And so with each of these different kinds of trauma, they present in different ways. It can lead to, excessive anxiety, panic, irritation, confusion. It can impact their ability to sleep. One thing, especially when we're talking about domestic violence as a trauma and the response and how it might affect people, is it affects relationships, right? Because the trauma exists within an intimate relationship. It's with someone who you're supposed to be able to trust, and have your back, it can impact their ability to trust other people and form relationships and have healthy relationships going forward. So again, there's different kinds of trauma when we talk about it. And, someone that's experiencing complex trauma, there might also be separate acute traumas that they're experiencing as well. And so how it affects their brain, how it affects their well-being and overall functioning in society, it's going to be very individualized and depend on the person. But what research shows us and what we've learned through multiple studies is that trauma does impact brain functioning. It does impact the way that people are able to think through things and their emotional and physical well-being.
So as Lauren mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, I am one of the Justice Court advocates out of Haven House, and I work out of 11 different jurisdictions, and I've seen pretty much the good, the bad, and the ugly of the system. And one of the things that I really wanted to touch on when we're talking about trauma is the way that, unfortunately, victims are treated in the courtroom. There seems to be some sort of attitude about how exactly a trauma victim should present herself or himself. And they tend to want this person who's been through so much to, be organized, have everything down pat, know exactly what's going on at all times. They want them to be calm, but they don't want them to be too calm, because that can come off as, that they don't care about what's going on with their case. They want them to maintain a consistent story, which I really want to touch on, because with trauma, again, like Tara was saying, there is brain trauma, and you tend to not be able to keep your story straight because of everything that's going on in your brain. It's a big ask to ask somebody to have everything down pat, maintain the exact same story every single time that they tell it. And also, there's trauma with going to court and being cross-examined, and the pressure of having to speak publicly about what's happened to you. You're not going to get the consistent story every time, but they tend to want that from you. You have to be understanding about what's going on with your case and not get angry about the outcome. You're supposed to understand, exactly how the system works. You're supposed to be sweet and reliable. And the reliability comes from before COVID, and this is one of the things that I'm really grateful for right now. Before COVID, they tended to want these complainants to come in every single court date and face their offender. When we've discovered through COVID, when everything went virtual, that that's really not necessary. They don't need to be in court every week to face their offender. They don't need to speak. They can do it over the phone, which is honestly a lot easier for them, a lot simpler for their mental health. And how trauma presents, they can be chaotic and emotional, but they can also be deadpan, and they have changing stories, and they're confused and they're angry, and sometimes they won't show up to court. But they're viewed as less reliable if any of those things are true. But it is unrealistic to expect all the things on the left side of the slide to present in a trauma victim. So my role as victim advocate, I alleviate the pressure from the victims. The minute that I get a domestic incident report or a police report, I give them a call and I talk through what they're feeling, what they're thinking, what they want to see happen with their case. And then I will make the calls to the people that they would normally have to call themselves when they usually don't have the numbers for those people. So I kind of act as the middleman between them and anyone that they would need to get in touch with, such as the district attorneys, the law clerks. I get their court dates for them. I check up on warrants and see if the offender has been arrested yet. There's also companionship. A lot of these people, unfortunately, do not have a lot of people who they've confided in that this is going on. And if they do, sometimes they're still going to court alone. So I provide court advocacy with them, and I go and I sit with them. I kind of act as like the bodyguard between them and, the offender, to make sure that we're in a place where the offender is not looking at her. And I am also sounding board. And it's honestly one of my favorite parts of the job, is to just be there to listen to when these people need to scream, because they have every right to scream in that moment. If they need to scream, if they need to yell, if they're frustrated with the system, I get frustrated with the system all the time. So I empathize with that with them, and I just make them feel a lot less alone. Explanations. Unfortunately, a lot of people in court don't understand that complainants don't necessarily understand the legal definitions, and they don't understand a lot about what's going on with their case, and they don't really explain it in a way that, you know, civilians would understand. So I explain once there's a sentence given. I spend a lot of time with the client just going over exactly what happened and why. I go over orders of protection with them and explain exactly what offender can and cannot do. I also assist with victim impact statements. Before a sentencing, the victim is allowed to write a statement and a letter to the judge explaining exactly how this incident or multiple incidents has affected her life. And then she's able to ask or request a sentence that she thinks would be suitable for her offender, as well as what type of order of protection she wants. And so I will sit with them and write that with them. And then I also help them self-advocate. You know, sometimes I will give them the number of the district attorney and say, you should really talk about this to them yourself. And I kind of just build up their self-esteem and help them regain control of their own life. And also allocating resources. You know, we've got, like Tara was saying, we've got a ton of resources at Haven House, but there's also a ton of resources out of Haven House. So I will make those referrals. I will get them counseling if they want counseling. And if it's a super high risk situation, I always allocate directly to Tara. Like right now.
Yes, thank you. And so the high risk team, as Sarah said, is one of the potential referrals a court advocate can make. And so what is the high risk team and why would they make that referral? So the high risk team is a multidisciplinary team. It's nationally recognized as best practice. And it really comes out of the work of Dr. Joslin Campbell, who created the danger assessment, which is one of the assessments that we use in working to identify cases that might be appropriate to be brought onto the team. And it's sort of the idea of if we can predict it, we can prevent it. So we work to identify cases that are at high risk. And we do that by, again, using that danger assessment, assessing and looking at high risk factors, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then once a case is identified as being appropriate for the team, it's brought onto the team. And then there's regular monthly meetings where we share updates, we discuss what's going on with the case, and we problem solve and work together to put in intervention plans based on the recommendation and expertise from the members of the team. And the goal of the high-risk team is to reduce the number of domestic violence homicides and near-lethal assaults. And so we do this by really focusing on containing the abuser or the batterer. We really try to make sure that we're not limiting the victim in terms of what they're able to do, but really focusing on holding the offender accountable. We also work to increase communication across the systems. And as I said, it is a multidisciplinary team. So we have partners on the team from CPS, DSS, probation, parole, law enforcement. There's members from law enforcement, as well as the DA's office and Haven House and the International Institute, which are two of the domestic violence agencies in the county. So all of these members of the team come together. We share expertise from each of those perspectives, and we really rely on each other, you know, again, that increased communication, working to make sure that every system is doing what they can to help keep the clients as safe as possible. You know, and as Sarah mentioned a couple of minutes ago, sometimes it can be frustrating, the limitations of the systems, right? And one of my favorite things of this job and the work that I get to do is learning more about how each of those systems function, learning more about what goes into it, and seeing the incredible work that everybody is doing. You know, everybody that's a part of the high risk team has chosen to be a part of it. They all are very passionate and care a lot about keeping survivors of domestic violence safer. And so that's what we're all working towards. And so as Sarah said, you know, it can be really frustrating sometimes when we run into limitations with systems. So in this job, getting to see the good work that people are doing, the changes that we're trying to create, and how dedicated people are to keeping victims safe. It's been a really rewarding part of this job. And so some of the successes that the high risk team has had, you know, we're able to increase monitoring of the offender once they're released from prison. So we're able to hold them, have higher levels of supervision when they're on parole. We're able to increase offender accountability. So maybe that is, a longer sentence, or, someone is being remanded or held in prison instead of being released. We're also able to increase the safety and security of the clients on the high-risk team. And the high-risk team has served over 160 survivors of domestic violence. So some of the things that we're able to do to help with security and safety, we can provide cameras, security cameras and installation. And we also, all of the advocates do very thorough safety planning. And so they're all trained in how to safety plan with clients. And then they have those conversations with clients to really make sure that they're thinking through ways to keep themselves safe in different situations. So as I mentioned, high risk factors are something we take a look at. The danger assessment is a tool that we use to assess how dangerous a relationship might be. So when I'm talking about domestic violence, high risk factors, what I'm talking about are high risk factors for domestic violence homicide. So this means that if these are present in a relationship, that relationship is at an increased risk of ending in the domestic violence victim being murdered by their partner. So again, and this is all sort of, these are all from the research done by Dr. Joslin Campbell in looking at cases that ended in domestic violence homicide and finding commonalities between cases. So stalking is one of the high risk factors. This is, and we're not just talking about like physical stalking, but also digital stalking. We know that now there are many ways that abusers can digitally stalk and harass and monitor the movements of their victim. So with this, 75% of DV homicide cases had a history of stalking in the relationship. So again, this is something that, is a high risk factor. That next point, if the victim believes that their offender is capable of killing them, chances are they're probably right. What research has shown us is that victims rarely, if ever, overestimate the amount of danger that they're in. So if someone is in an abusive relationship and they believe that their partner is capable of killing them, that is something we want to take seriously. And again, that's probably something that they're correct about. And so we want to make sure we're doing what we can to protect and keep that person safer. If the physical abuse is increasing in frequency or severity, obviously with this, the more often it's happening and the more severe it is, the more dangerous it is, and the more likely it can end in a fatality. If physical abuse is happening during pregnancy, obviously with this one, not only is the mom at risk, but also the baby, and it can have other effects on the mom's health as well. And so this is another high risk factor that's been identified by Dr. Joslin Campbell. As Sarah mentioned earlier, leaving is the most dangerous time in a relationship. So within those first 6 months after someone has left, they are at an increased risk of being murdered by their partner. And so that's not to say that someone can't leave their abuser safely. But there should be some safety planning, and there needs to be some thinking it through and planning around how can you leave safely? What's the safest way to leave? So that's another high risk factor. Also, if the offender is unemployed, and this one kind of took me by surprise when I started doing this work, but if you think about it, it does make sense. And really with this one, if an offender is unemployed, now they have all of the time in the world to abuse and stalk and harass their partner, right? So now they have all of the time to use to engage in those abusive tactics, and it can lead to a very dangerous situation. If the stepchild is present in the home, and with this one, it's really about jealousy. That stepchild is going to be an everyday reminder to the abuser that their partner was with someone before them. And for someone who is extremely controlling and very jealous, this can be problematic, right? And so that's another high risk factor, is being extremely controlling, very jealous, sort of this belief that they have the right to to own, to their victim. They have the right to their body. They have the right to their thoughts, their time, that they get to control where they go and what they do. And that can be a very dangerous way of thinking and how that plays out in the relationship. Forced sex is another high risk factor. And the language on the danger assessment specifically, it doesn't use the word rape. It asks, did your offender ever make you have sex with them when you didn't want to? And that's intentional because many times, especially if they're married, people don't identify it necessarily as rape. And so when we're talking about it, we use very specific language around that. The next one, strangulation. With this one, this is one of the most lethal forms of intimate partner violence, and it is the top indicator of future fatality. And strangulation is particularly dangerous. One, the act itself is incredibly dangerous and can lead to death in a minute. It also is it's very dangerous. The person who's willing to engage in this behavior is a dangerous person. So if a client ever reports to us that there is a history of strangulation, we always encourage them to be seen by a medical provider, and we share resources with them where they might be able to have an exam. Because it's important to know that with strangulation, up to 50% of the time, there's no external signs of injury. So, the person that strangled might have defensive wounds, but the person that was strangled might not have any visible signs that they were strangled. And again, this is the most lethal form of intimate partner violence and the top indicator of future fatality. So something we really want to take seriously and be very aware of when working with clients. If there's illegal drug use, alcohol abuse going on, and with this, there is a common misconception that drug use or alcohol use causes domestic violence, and that is not the case. It is not the cause of someone to be abusive. We know plenty of people who abuse drugs and alcohol who aren't abusive. So it's not a causation, but what can do is exacerbate the abuse or make it worse. And so it can become more dangerous if there's substance use happening in the home. If the offender has access to weapons, or if they own guns, or if there's a gun in the home, that also is a high risk factor and makes that relationship more dangerous. If the offender is making threats to kill themselves, threats to kill their partner, threats to use a weapon, we encourage all our clients to take all threats seriously. If an abuser is making these threats, then the likelihood that they're going to follow through is there. So again, those threats, we encourage our clients to take them seriously. And what we worry about when they make suicidal threats or threats to kill themselves is that what they might do is first kill their victim and or children and then kill themselves. So that's something that we want to be very aware of. And again, that's addressed on that danger assessment. And that last point, if the offender has broken through the door or window to get to the victim, this point actually comes from the New York State Fatality Review Team, which is a team that reviews domestic violence homicide cases. And they take a look at all of, from birth to the time of the homicide, the system's involvement and what had played out, and with the intention of learning more so we can prevent them in the future. So one of the things they found is in 14 out of 25 domestic violence homicides, it included the offender breaking through the door window in order to get to the victim. So while this isn't on the danger assessment that we use, this is something that we consider a high risk factor and is something that I talk about when we talk about high risk factors. So again, we use these then to assess the dangerousness of a domestic violence relationship and whether or not a client might be appropriate to bring onto the high risk team. And all of the court advocates are trained in using the danger assessment. They're trained in what the high risk team is and when it might be appropriate to make a referral. And so, the work that Sarah does and other court advocates is incredibly important in identifying these cases that are potentially high risk and could potentially end in a fatality.
Yeah, being a court advocate is it's difficult to navigate the system with the client, and it's unfortunately it's not built for for victims of trauma. But I think what's really important about having a court advocate work with the victim while they're going through the court case is that very often we are the only person in that courtroom looking them dead in the eye and saying, I believe you. There's a lot of victim blaming that goes on. There's a lot of disbelief in what they're saying. And it's really important to have someone who is trauma informed to walk with them so that we understand their actions. We understand their thought processes. We're not blaming them for the way that they are reacting to what has happened with them. So up on the screen, we've got this came from the surveys that we send out through our agency. And it says, my advocate has been an incredible resource. She has advocated for me when I was too weak to do so, and she provided me with valuable resources and referrals to help me manage the trauma I have been dealing with as a result of the abuse I experienced. I feel so blessed to have her as an ally. I have been so lost since everything has happened, and she has given me hope. To her, I will be forever grateful. And I get a lot of feedback like that. And I've heard a lot about that. About how grateful they are to have someone who, understands the court system, but understands trauma at the same time, and is able to walk that journey with them. I kind of wanted to leave off on a happier story, but it also shows just how deeply rooted trauma is. And also I want to plug a book. It's one of my favorite books. It's called The Body Keeps the Score. And it's by Bessel van der Kolk, and it's all about how trauma, even though you don't think that it's affecting you, it affects you. And so great book, check it out. But I had a client that I've been working with for about a year, and she and the offender had a 7-year-old nonverbal autistic child together. And the offender had been abusing her for years. And then one day he took it too far and he ended up being remanded in jail, and he's still there today. And as soon as he was removed from the house, as soon as the toxic, aspect of that household was removed, her nonverbal autistic son started to speak. And I think that that's a really interesting thing to point out, just how, it's not just the victim who's affected by these, it's their children, it's their friends, it's their family, it's their brain. Like, there's so much that is just internalized by whoever's in that household. And she and I actually spoke yesterday, and she's doing incredibly well. So is her son. And he's facing up to 15 years. So there are success stories. It's hard to navigate a lot of the time, but there are really, really rewarding parts of doing this work and working with trauma victims.
So at this point, if there's questions, we'd be happy to take it. That's some contact information up there for both myself and Sarah. And as always, if you have any questions about our services, or you have a client who might need services, the hotline is up there, the 884-6000 phone number. It's open 24/7. I think one thing that I've sort of learned doing this work is that I think a lot of people think of that hotline as being used just to come into shelter, but you can use it really for anything. We have clients that maybe their counselor, is after hours and they're having some kind of crisis and their counselor is not available. They just need someone to talk to. You can use that to call the hotline. Maybe they're just having a hard day and they need to talk it through with someone. So again, that hotline is open 24/7. It's available, and the hotline staff are trained to handle those calls and to support the victims in that moment.
Tara and Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today for this presentation. It's just incredible, the work that goes hand in hand with walking the client through the court systems, and then also assessing based on research what could happen in the event that we are not there for this client and we are not identifying these risk factors. This is such crucial information that our community should be aware of, and today, thanks to you both, are. For those of you listening today, feel free right now to insert any questions into the Q&A portion that you can see down below on your screen. There's also a chat function too. You can leave a question there. We'd be happy to address them right now. So I'll give just a couple moments for anyone who has a question to do so. In the meantime, I thought maybe one or both of you could address a question that came to me beforehand, talking about the ACEs, the Adverse Child risk factors that are there. You both know that term better than I do. Is there any kind of commonality that we're seeing amongst domestic violence survivors throughout their childhood that, or maybe even abusers as well, anything that's common between experiences that have been had as young children leading up to their state in life in the future? Are you seeing that?
Both abusers and victims tend to have some sort of chaotic childhood in one way or another. They might have had abusive parents. They might have been sexually abused as children. They might have had parents who went through a messy divorce or had like a really rocky marriage, so they didn't get to see, examples of like what a healthy relationship is. Their father might have abused their mother. The mother might have abused their father. Both, pretty much. And that's what one of the hardest things that I have to kind of talk through with my clients is, unfortunately, victims of domestic violence make excuses for their offenders because they've gone through a lot in their past. And you have to kind of talk through with them, all right, but like, so have you, and you're not over here abusing people, Mm-hmm. So there is definitely commonality for both victims and offenders.
Yeah, I would add to that and say, yes, I've seen that. There's definitely that intergenerational piece of trauma, right? When, and specifically when we're talking about abuse, and Sarah kind of touched on it, if you're raised in a family, in a home where domestic violence is happening, what you're having modeled for you are unhealthy and abusive relationships. And so then when you become an adult, that's what you know. And so being in a relationship that's abusive feels normal. It feels like this is how it's supposed to be. And that plays a part too in what can make it really hard for someone to leave their abusive partner. Even if they're able to recognize the seriousness of the abuse, leaving their partner means entering into the unknown, right? Like they know what to expect with this abuser. They know, what they're going to do, how they're going to behave. One thing that I've learned is that victims are incredibly smart. They are incredibly good at surviving and learning how to survive. And so when they're with an abuser, they learn, what that abuser, what sets them off, what they're going to do, how to avoid it. And so leaving that partner means, now they're going to be on their own, or maybe they're with a new partner, and maybe they'll be a healthy partner, maybe they won't, maybe it'll be a whole different set of abuse, right? So that plays a part in, in people staying in those relationships.
And I think just to piggyback off of that, I get very nervous when my clients jump back into a relationship very quickly after getting out of an abusive one. Because like Tara was saying, if you get so accustomed to abuse, if you get so accustomed to being gaslit, you know exactly what's coming, and like you get into that cycle, it's very hard to spot when someone's trying to suck you in and they're actually abusive too. They are rescued by this Prince Charming. And usually the Prince Charmings at the beginning of relationships are not actually charming. So they rush back into a relationship because they want to escape that one, and then they find that they have actually been trapped yet again. So I get very nervous when my clients jump that quickly, because there's no resting period where they can figure out and decompress and look at their relationship from like a third party. Yeah.
Right. Another question that comes to mind is, Sarah, have you noticed an increase in potentially the confidence in survivors as they've gone through court cases, maybe in person before COVID, and now they're doing everything over Zoom and over virtual media? Have you noticed anything like that take place in the life of the survivors as a result of all these changes?
Yeah, it can honestly go either way though. I've had great experiences with the court system, and I've had really negative experiences with the court system and how they've treated survivors of DV. Unfortunately, trials are exhausting. They're re-traumatizing. Defense attorney's main mechanism is to gaslight someone who's been gaslit for years, so it's very re-traumatizing, very scary. They doubt themselves. I've had a lot of clients, be ready to testify and then not want to do it at the last minute because it's just a lot. In terms of confidence, though, once they do testify, once they write, I find that victim impact statements are incredibly empowering for them. They usually tell me that they feel a lot better once they've written the victim impact statement and they've all put it down on something tangible, you know, to have a voice for the first time in so long. It does help with their confidence, and it also helps with their confidence in leaving the relationship. Once they start talking in a court of law about what they've gone through, they're like, oh yeah, like I shouldn't be in that relationship, you know, because sometimes they waffle. Sometimes, you know, it's possible to still love the person but hate the abuse. And, you know, sometimes they waffle, and it does help going through the court process to remind them, oh, like this is really negative. I can't believe that I'm like here. So it does help with the confidence. And like I touched on earlier, COVID has not done many good things, but one of the only good things that it has done for my job and the people that I serve is that we realized finally clients don't have to be in person in court every day. So it gives them extra time away from the scene to collect themselves and to think and reflect and work on healing rather than being re-traumatized once a week until the court case is over. So.
Right. A similar question came up in the chat here. And this is geared towards you, Sarah. Do you end up seeing clients more than once after you've seen them through one case? So have you had repeat clients come through your doors, perhaps?
Unfortunately, yeah. I get a lot of repeat. And the thing about my job is a lot of people will ghost me. If they, you know, get back with the offender, they will pretty much just not respond to me anymore. But then I'll get another police report and I'll reach out again, and I will get multiple, I've had multiple clients that I've worked with in the past that I now work with again. It's unfortunately, like the statistics said, it takes 7 times on average to leave an abusive relationship. You know, unfortunately, that is, you know, sorry, my computer just said that I'm getting an update, so I'm nervous. But yeah, so I do get repeat clients. I get repeat offenders with multiple clients. That has been something too. We've had, you know, multiple women come forward about them. It's not uncommon. So.
And I think it's also safe for us to answer too, within the Haven House shelter, we have seen clients, the same client come through our doors on a number of occasions as well. It's just the nature of domestic violence at large. And that statistic truly does reflect the reality, which is unfortunate. Folks, feel free to, again, send in any more questions that you have. We'd love to answer anything related to this topic or otherwise. A question that did come up earlier too was specific to Haven House, to the shelter program, and it was, do we keep families together where there are boys over the age of 12? And that is the case. We do keep families together when they do come to Haven House for our shelter services. When they do make that call at that 884-6000 number, we are addressing who is this family unit. Do we have the space for them? And if so, we'll accept the entire family. Correct me if I'm wrong, Tara and Sarah, but if there is a child over the age of 18, they would be admitted as an adult, I believe.
Correct.
Right. All right. Any other? Oh, so a couple of questions that we have also that just came up. This one might be more for you, Sarah. This person asks, why can't the abusers get more time in prison? Can you address that?
Got 10 minutes left. So there are multiple reasons. And it is on, it depends on the charge. You know, the case that I mentioned earlier, he's facing up to 15 years because of the charges that he was charged on, and he has a criminal history. There are a lot of things that they look at when they are sentencing these people. They look at the criminal history, they look at the severity of the crime. If the client is or is not willing to participate, that can play a factor. But then there's also the bail reform. And unfortunately, New York State, there's been a bail reform at the beginning of either last year or this year, I can't remember. But basically, certain charges, you cannot hold bail for that person. So they cannot be remanded anymore unless the crime is that serious. and I hate using words like that serious, because DV in general is serious. Like every single thing that you can be charged on is serious. But there are multiple reasons why they can't get more time in prison. There are multiple plea deals that can be made so that we don't have to go to trial. And a lot of it too, and that's what really stinks, is a lot of pressure is put on the complainant to cooperate the entire time, or else they will drop those charges down. And they will, give it an adjournment and contemplation for dismissal and see what happens for the next 6 months. So it's really tricky, but there are multiple factors going into why they don't get nearly as much jail time as I would like to see them. Yes.
I'll also just add to that too, that abusers tend to be incredibly good at manipulating, and that includes manipulating systems and presenting in a way, that comes across like, oh, this person would never be abusive, right? And it really can call into question the reliability of what the victim is reporting. So that can definitely play a part too. And, the abusers can be really good at manipulating systems. And, we also have seen quite a few abusers who are in positions of power or authority. And so they have those ins and they have those connections and ways to manipulate and sort of skate around being held accountable. So that's another sort of layer of that goes into it as well.
Yeah. And to touch on what you said about like knowing people, like I've got, a lot of my towns are very small. Everybody knows everybody. And that includes these offenders often knowing the police officers, knowing the court clerks, knowing this person, that person. And one of the ADAs that I was talking to last night had a really great quote. She said, everyone's father of the year when they're in handcuffs. And that basically means, they present as like, oh, like, I just want to get back to see my children. I just want to, protect I didn't mean for it to go this far. Like, they're very, very good. And I've seen it time and time again. They're incredibly smart people, but not in the good way.
Right. It's unfortunate how cunning the abusers can be. Right. One other thought, perhaps Sarah or Tara, you can address this, but could you go into a little bit more about safety planning, maybe what that looks like and how you would address it with a client?
Well, during every intake, I safety plan regardless. And then I'm pretty much safety planning and adjusting the safety plan throughout my time working with the client. The first thing that I ask her is if she's got people who know what's going on. Because then we kind of come up with a plan that, like, if something's going on in the house, she's got somewhere that she can flee to, or someone she can text. I come up with code words for them to text their friends if something's going on, and then their friends might be able to call 911 for them on their behalf. I tell them to not wear high heels out in public and to always kind of use the buddy system, stick with your buddy for the time being. One of the great things about Haven House is that we do get amazing donations, and we can give security systems a lot of the time, or at least gift cards to Amazon or something like that, so that they can purchase security systems. But I always like to have a camera outside of that property, because offenders, even if they're not breaking in, they tend to like to circle the premises. I make sure that they are taking screenshots of every single text that comes in from the offenders and saving it all to a folder. If, I've got one woman right now, one client down, she just moved to North Carolina, and only like 1 or 2 people know her new address. And it's very tricky though, because unfortunately, like when you're given a new order of protection, your address most times are listed there. So it's very tricky to safety plan around the address. So like all you can do is like make that home as safe as possible while they're living there. It's very difficult to not allow an offender to know exactly where you are. And then we've got a great guy named Chuck who does free lock changes for victims of domestic violence that we can refer them out to, and he'll just come and change the lock on their door. And, obviously I mentioned shelter if the situation is that dire. I mentioned shelter, and we are a completely secure building, and nobody knows our address. So.
Yeah. And so just to sort of add to that a little bit, with safety planning, like Sarah went into some really great examples, but it's very individualized. So, what works for one person might not work for someone else. And so our advocates are all trained to, be able to have those conversations. And the goal with safety planning really is to think through what might I do in this situation? What can I do to help keep myself safe in this situation? You know, and so really putting those interventions in place and thinking it through ahead of time, right? Because when you're in the moment, when something, you know, when a situation is escalating and someone is getting violent, that's not the best time to make a plan and to think about what you're going to do to keep yourself safe. So thinking about it ahead of time. And again, you know, like Sarah provided some really great examples of what that can look like, but it's very individualized. What works for one person may or may not work for someone else. And it's ever evolving. You know, the tactics that an abuser is using might change. They might escalate. They might, right? And especially like when we're talking about digital tech safety planning, sometimes if you like shut down an account, then they might like switch to a different account, or it might make the situation more dangerous. So we want to just be mindful of that when we're safety planning and thinking it through.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One final question came in, and then I think we'll wrap things up. One of our participants mentioned that men are also victims of domestic violence, as we know well, in the Haven House world. Do you see more reluctance to seek help in this population?
I see a vast underreporting. And I know this because we know the statistics, we know that it's happening, but I very, very, very rarely get a police report with the male listed as a victim. And honestly, the police reports that I do get with the male listed as the victim, a lot of times are the abusers playing victim. So there's a severe underreporting of male domestic violence victims coming forward about their experiences, specifically also in the gay community. Not a lot of people are, not a lot of men are reporting those abusive relationships either. And it's really sad and hard because, you know, there's this stigma that, you know, the whole be a man, and they're afraid that they'll appear less of a man if they come forward and say, my wife is literally hitting me. So it's bad. It's really bad.
It is. And all of our services are, you know, available to, you know, men and women. You know, the domestic violence education and parenting after violence program is one specifically that, you know, I remember we would definitely get men, you know, that would come to the class. And I'm thinking there's one client in particular that I'm thinking of, and you could tell like the first time he came, you know, he was in a room full of women who had been abused. And you could tell, I think everybody was a little uneasy, right? But as the group progressed, there was a certain amount of comfort and trust that was built. And that group in particular, I remember it being very, like they just were all very supportive of each other. And so, you know, we definitely do provide those services to, you know, to men and women. But as Sarah was saying, you know, we definitely see that men, there's additional layers of challenge in reporting and feeling comfortable reporting.
Mm-hmm. That's very true. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today on this 13th day of October. We're so grateful for your presence, for listening, and for staying with us up until 1 o'clock. A brief survey will be sent to each of you for your feedback. We really appreciate just taking a couple moments of your time and telling us how we can improve on these for now and for the future as well. This presentation will be also linked on our YouTube page, so that also will be sent your way. Again, if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to us. You'll have my contact information as well as Tara and Sarah's. And we do appreciate you joining us for the next 2 webinars taking place next Wednesday at noon and the following Wednesday as well. So thank you so much, everyone, again, for joining us. We appreciate your support. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.